Hello and welcome to the Intrusible Chamber. It's my privilege this evening to introduce my listeners to one of the pivotal scholars of the turn of the 18th century, a theologian, a mystic, a classicist, a poet, and a political reformer, perhaps the most consequential of all the Catholic critics of Louis XIV. Francois de Sélénac de la Motte Fenelon was born in Périgord in southwestern France in 1651, the nephew of one Bishop of Salas, a de facto hereditary bishopric for the Fenelon family. They had occupied the seat of the bishop for 15 generations. Fenelon went on to study theology at Duplessis and then at the seminary of Saint-Sulpice, whose founder happened to be a friend to Francois' own patron, the Marquess de Fenelon. Having abandoned a goal of missionary work to either Canada, Greece, or the Levant, he became a prior at Carignac Monastery and a religious counselor to the Huguenots, in particular Huguenot girls entering the Catholic Church. Thereafter, following the illegalization of Protestantism across France when Louis XIV signed the Edict of Fontainebleau, he became a missionary to the Protestants in the Saintonge region in the west. His friendship with one Paul de Bevilliers, the Duke of Bevilliers, earned him a recommendation for the role of rural tutor to one Louis, Duke of Burgundy, the grandson of Louis XIV, and expected to be the future King of France. In this position, Fenelon truly excelled. This subject will form the backdrop for when I discuss Telemachus, but suffice to say, it was a position that would transform Fenelon's life, role in French politics, and French letters. As a royal tutor, he won influence over one Madame Maintenon, Louis XIV's morganatic wife, and was named to the Académie Française and was even made the Archbishop of Cambrai. However, two scandals will spell ruin for Fenelon's remarkable career at the French court. The first was Fenelon's association with one Madame Guyon, his first cousin. Guyon was at the centre of what was called the Quietist controversy, the fear that Guyon's views were too similar to one Miguel de Molinos, a Spanish priest who had received a papal condemnation. Fenelon, alongside Louis-Antoine de Noailles, later the Cardinal Archbishop of Paris and opponent of Jansenism, a crypto-Calvinist Augustinian sect of Catholicism within France, issued the Articles of Issy, intended to correct Madame Guyon's beliefs on prayer. Then entered one Bossuet. Jacques Benin Bossuet, the Bishop of Meaux, was the most articulate defender of Louis XIV's absolutism, the French counterpart to Robert Filmer in England, and one of the greatest orators of the 17th century. His Politics Drawn from the Very Words of Holy Scripture is the magnum opus of apologetics for absolute monarchy. Bossuet was also a great historian, combining universal history with biblical exegesis, perhaps the last great historian to do so. He had supported Fenelon and was engaged in a long and friendly correspondence with him, but it was Bossuet who had also consecrated Fenelon as bishop. Yet when he was asked to write an exposition on the Articles of Issy, Fenelon wrote his own counter-exposition to Bossuet, the Maxims of the Saints, which was condemned as unorthodox by then Pope Innocent XII. In the same year, 1699, Fenelon's unformed Telemachus, intended in its current state as a private work for the Duke of Burgundy's education, was published and was perceived directly as a criticism of Louis XIV. Condemned as both a political and a religious maverick, Fenelon was banished to his archdiocese in Cambrai. In exile, he was able to maintain a profound influence over the court and the Duke of Burgundy. Even the Duke's premature death in 1712 did not quash Fenelon's intrigues, which instead transferred to the Duke of Orleans before Fenelon's own death in 1715. The damage done to his reputation in the Quietist controversy was repaired by Fenelon's uncompromising stance on Jansenism. Any of these aspects of Fenelon's career could form a dedicated episode. My original intention with the series was to structure a presentation comparing Fenelon and Bossuet, but given the centrality of the Quietist controversy and their rivalry, I feel unqualified to cover that topic. I'm not a theologian. The same goes for a topic revolving around Fenelon's mysticism and his works, such as that of the Inner Life. So, encountering the life of Fenelon, I've decided to focus on two aspects: his humanism, as demonstrated in his works, his Lives of the Ancient Philosophers and his Dialogues with the Dead, and his political reform program. These aspects of Fenelon mesh well with my previous talks, at least I believe so, when it comes to Dante, the de-Christianizing of the most Christian king, which was the episode I've just completed, and even the ending of the Great Schism, as we shall see. The subtitle for this episode is The Last of the Medieval Humanists, and I want to unpack what humanism is very simply at its most reductive level possible, which isn't going to satisfy me by the end of the discussion, but just in terms of holding people over. Humanism is the pursuit of cultural, philosophical ideals which are indebted not to exclusively Christian sources, but in particular Greco-Roman civilization, the study of the classics. Indeed, as a presage of this mingling of Christianity and the classics, I already referred to the fact that Fenelon first desired to be a missionary before he was a prior in a monastery, acting in the religious formation of Huguenot girls about to convert to Catholicism. But I want to start this conversation really by looking into this fascinating series of letters which were communicated in the 1670s regarding a potential missionary work in Greece and the Levant. And Fenelon says this: I meditate on a great journey. The whole of Greece opens before me, and the Sultan flies in terror. The Peloponnesus breathes again in liberty, and the church of Corinth shall forever flourish once more. The voice of the apostle shall be heard there again. I seem to be transported among those enchanting places and those precious ruins, where, while I collect the most curious relics of antiquity, I imbibe also its spirit. I see, for the Areopagus, where St. Paul the Areopagus, where St. Paul declared the sages of the world, the unknown God. But next to what is sacred, I am delighted with what is profane, and I disdain not to descend into the Piraeus where Socrates drew up the plans of his republic. I reach the double summit of Parnassus. I pluck the laurels of Delphi. I revel in the charms of the temple. When will the blood of the Turks mingle with that of the Persians on the plains of Marathon and leave the whole of Greece to philosophy and the fine arts who regard her as to their country? Nor will I forget thee, O how thou happy island consecrated by a celestial vision of the well-beloved disciple. O happy Patmos, I will kneel upon the earth and kiss the steps of the apostle, and I shall believe that the heavens open on my sight. I behold the downfall of schism and the union of the East and the West, and the day spring again, dawning in Asia after a night of such long darkness. What he's presaging is not just perhaps elements of Western Orientalism, but a great longing, a desire to take his fascination with what he regards as the profane elements of Greek history, Greek classical antiquity, civilization, with a desire basically to relive the episodes of Paul's missions to the various cities along the Aegean coastline. Indeed, when I was reading this, especially looking into his desire for a new religious resurgence in the Greek East, a desire to see what is basically explicitly stated, the downfall of the Turk, the rebirth of a new civilization, and the union between East and West. The first person I thought of was Bessarion, a person who I covered quite extensively when talking about the prospects in the 15th century, about ending the Great Schism, a Greek classicist and a great scholar who had converted to the cause of Catholicism and was an advisor not just to the Greek side but also the Latin side, and eventually he became a cardinal in the Catholic Church alongside his compatriot Isidore of Kiev, who attempted again to bring Catholicism and the unity of the church to Moscow and failed miserably in that endeavor. So in this sense, you can say that Fenelon, embarking on this great journey to see that the Turkish Empire would collapse, that Christianity would reign in the East, the schism would end, and indeed that both the classics and Christianity could be reified by such a mission. It didn't escape me that in one of his greatest works, the Dialogues of the Dead, the Dialogue des Morts, he happens to invoke the memory of this, again to us, rather obscure Greek theologian, Bessarion. the way that the dialogues of the dead are structured is that he takes various figures. They don't even necessarily have to be real figures. He takes the gods. He has the gods interact with philosophers. He has philosophers and poets such as Homer interact with Achilles. And this is essentially a way for him to create a ahistorical series of debates, discussions, dialogues between interesting persons who are more or less contemporaneous to the same event, as if to expound moral lessons, mos maiorum, the great lesson to be imbibed. And in particular, his discussion regarding Bessarion is actually directed towards Louis XI, one of the most notorious, you can say, pre-Machiavellian kings of France, who was also known as the Universal Spider. And just reading a short segment from the Dialogues of the Dead, I think is actually quite revealing in terms of what would later see so much with Fenelon's attitude towards learning contrasted with politics. This is Louis XI supposedly speaking to Cardinal Bessarion. You had better have spent less time in reading the authors of other ages and more in studying the customs of the present. You behaved yourself like a pedant who knows nothing at all of the world. And the Bessarion in response says, and yet I have fully studied the laws of Draco, Solon, Lycurgus, Solon in particular being the lawmakers of Athens and Lacedaemonian civilization, Sparta in particular, with those of Plato's Republic, all the remains of ancient orators who had governed any people in the short and best commentators and schoolmen who have treated of the polity of the Republic. I love a scholar who is fit for no kind of business and knows nothing but what he has read, far better than a disquiet, subtle, and enterprising mind who is an enemy to justice and humanity and confounds all of mankind. You can read that and say essentially that Fenelon, as the wise classical scholar, is looking at Bessarion and saying that despite the fact that he may be seen as a bygone relic, he is a Catholic Greek Orthodox convert representing a failed initiative to bring about the end of the schism between East and West, speaking to one of the most mischievous and ambitious intriguers of the 15th century, who was King Louis XI, but ultimately decries his whole political ambition, his whole enterprise as being nothing compared to the pursuit of learning for its own sake. If you're going to say that Bessarion actually Fenelon wants to be associated with Bessarion in this instance, no, Fenelon was far more ambitious than simply seeking the pursuits of that of a simple scholar. Emphasis on what he said at the end of his letters regarding his potential Greek ambition. The dawning in Asia after a night of such long darkness to light, the light of God, but also people have looked at Fenelon and tried to look at him as the beginning of a Enlightenment tradition. In particular, this was a short segment taken from Eliza Follen's memoirs for Francois Fenelon in her selection of writings of Fenelon. Following his aborted project to become a missionary abroad, to enable himself to live in Paris, the Bishop of Sarlat, his uncle, resigned to him the priory of Carignac. This benefice, which was worthy about 3,000 or 4,000 livres a year, was the only one which Fenelon had until his 43rd year. For 10 years, he devoted himself to the simple direction of the community of women. There may not be wanting those who would say that such an employment at that time of life must have circumscribed his mind by fixing it on uninteresting details and useless studies. It was, however, at the period that he wrote his first works, the Treatise on the Education of Girls and the Treatise on the Mission of the Clergy. The first of these was not composed for the public, but for his friend, the Duchess of Beauvilliers. Thus, a work which was originally intended for the use of a single family has become an elementary book, equally adopted to every family and at all times and all places. Indeed, that's also the case for Telemachus. But I want to emphasize there that this was very much the opinion of sort of the beginning of the 19th century, that compared to his later exploits, this would seem to be a rather mundane enterprise. Well, part of his mission seems to be countering obscurantism. He's very much focused on not just the education of nobles, but in the prospects and the ability for broader education, evangelizing, missionary work in all forms. And it's actually the treatise on the education of girls, which it shouldn't be surprising, has actually endured as perhaps part of the reason why scholars today are interested in Fenelon. In part, the fact that he decided to dedicate much of his earlier life to the education of women. But this particular aspect regarding, again, appealing to missionary work in the East, looking on his station as a scholar and attempting to revive and maintain the interests of the quote unquote ancient philosophies and bring them to everyone, whether it be princes and dukes and courtiers of the court of Louis XIV or Huguenot girls who are being received into the Catholic Church. This flows into his overall toleration of Protestantism. This is taken from another memoir, From the Lives of the Ancient Philosophers. The success with which Fenelon had acquitted himself of the duties of his office as a Catholic priest in all matters where Protestants or nearly made converts were concerned, made Louis XIV, King of France, desirous of securing his services towards gaining over such Huguenots as still remained in the kingdom, this following the official legalization of Protestantism in France. The province of Poitou in the Santon was appointed for the scene of his labours. Before he entered upon them, he was presented to Louis, the king. The king desired to state any wishes that he might entertain connected with his mission. The only request he made was that the troops and every species of the military parade might be removed far from the province of which was to have his direction. Violence and persecution of any description whatsoever were not only odious but sinful in the eyes of Fenelon. Sincerity and love were his weapons, and with these arms alone he won to his way of thinking many whom no dangers could be terrified from their original faith, whilst on the contrary, other hapless provinces were desolated with fire and sword, without being able in a single instance to shake the firmness of the wretched sufferers who nobly sacrificed both property and life, rather than assent with their lips to doctrines which they could not believe in their hearts. A fascinating aspect of Fenelon is that his, again, emphasis on persuasion rather than coercion as a method of making France a single religious whole, that being Catholic, was completely at odds with established French practice, which only is subtly alluded to here. The best example of this was forcing Huguenot families to have French soldiers billeted to them, given that they tended to be on the countryside, whether it be on the countryside facing Spain or the countryside facing the Spanish Netherlands or then the Austrian Netherlands. It seemed again that this was affected both policies, not only of neutralizing potential rebellious zones and defecting from one side in the conflict, but also, again, ensuring that in order to avoid that fate, Huguenot families need to convert in order to spare being billeted. But Fenelon here is going completely against established practice. The principles on which Fenelon acted himself, he laboured to impart more especially to those who were likely one day to have dominion over others. To Prince Charles, the son of James II, better known to history as the Pretender, he earnestly recommended toleration in religious matters. A little correction, this would have been Bonnie Prince Charlie, who was the grandson of James II and the son of James the Old Pretender. Should he ever be restored to the throne of his ancestors, no human power, said he, can force the impenetrable entrenchments of the freedom of the mind. Compulsion never persuades, it only makes hypocrites. When kings interfere in matters of religion, they enslave instead of protecting it. Give civil liberty to all, and by approving all religions as indifferent, but by patiently permitting, not by approving all religions as indifferent, but by patiently permitting what God permits, and by endeavouring to teach persons a right mode of thinking by mildness and persuasion. For reference, perhaps again, this could help understand Bonnie Prince Charlie's rather syncretic understanding of religion. He begins as a Catholic, brought up in France. He becomes a Freemason, and then he is rumoured to have converted to Anglicanism during one of his brief stays in England. So the religious reputation of Bonnie Prince Charlie is rather infamous when it comes to many of his Catholic partisans. But nevertheless, this whole idea of sort of a gentle permeation of religion is completely at odds with the policy which is being used by Louis XIV. And in terms of the overall wisdom of that policy, again, perhaps you only need to look at someone like James II and say that he didn't intend to impose Catholicism through force. He tended to impose Catholicism by giving Catholics in his administration certain liberties or indulgences, as they were referred to. But such was the Protestant hysteria within England at that time that even those small measures towards protecting Catholicism and having a Catholic king wouldn't suffice in terms of being able to win over more converts. So perhaps in this case, Fenelon, through his caution for moderation and the protection of, again, basic civil liberties, that one comes into the Catholic faith willingly, again, from a Christian point of view, very consistent, but from a political point of view, we don't exactly have the results of which we can test that against. This next segment is taken, again, from the Dialogues with the Dead. It's Solon talking to Alcibiades. Solon, the great lawgiver of Athens, and Alcibiades, an Athenian general during the Peloponnesian Wars, often considered to be the great strategist behind the disastrous Syracusan adventure during the Peloponnesian Wars. And in particular, what Fenelon is trying to do in terms of this exposition between Solon and Alcibiades is talking about the unity of mankind, which again follows on from the notion of attempting to foster religious unity through persuasion as opposed to coercion. How horrid and barbarous is it to see one people supporting with the lives of another and perpetually disquieting them, as the head of a family ought never to be so taken up with the thoughts of making his family great, so as to disturb the repose of a whole people for the sake of it, of which he and his family are but a member. So ought not the head of a nation, hurried by the wildness of ambition and brutal conduct, place a false glory in increasing power of his people and troubling the repose of and enslaving of neighboring people? Any one nation is as much a member of the whole race of mankind as any one family is of a particular nation. Every man is far from obliged to mankind in general, our great commonwealth, than to our own private country. It is therefore far more unjust for a people to act offensively against another than for any private family to act against the commonwealth. To renounce humanity does not denote unpoliteness or barbarism, but also the savage blindness of rogues and bandits, and in such a case was not only the loss of the characters of men, but become the destroyers of mankind. This particular emphasis on his admonition towards coercion, conflict, war, his open appeal to Protestants, his desire to see the end of the schism, to reach out and acquire Greek converts and converts in the Levant. On the one hand, you can say that, yes, his Christian sort of mannerisms here won't sort of shudder from the prospect of bringing the Turk down, as if, again, it were the conquest of Alexander the Great again. So when he's considering the mankind in general, he's very much considering Christian mankind, and he's looking at Louis XIV and his wars against other great Christian kingdoms, and he is decrying it. And that, again, will be part of the reason for the ultimate failure of his political legacy and for his exile to his archbishopric in Cambrai. Regarding his overall political legacy and his mission, this is a segment from Van Kley's The Religious Causes of the French Revolution. United by an ardent piety, perhaps a common hostility to politically powerful figures such as the Letellier family, a group known as the Devout Group coalesced around the figure of the Duke of Burgundy, next in line to the throne after the Dauphin, which included Louis XIV's trusted advisor, one Duc de Chevreuse, and the director of the Royal Council of Finance, the Duc de Beauvilliers, the great friend and patron of Fenelon, and the husband of the Duchess de Beauvilliers, who, again, perhaps, if we're going to talk about this in terms of the influence of women at court, perhaps it's to the Duchess ultimately that Fenelon owed his meteoric rise. The group's key figure, however, was one Francois de Sélénac de la Motte Fenelon, who was the spiritual director of the king's former mistress and new wife, Madame de Maintenon, before becoming preceptor of the royal children, and hence the Duke of Burgundy's tutor in 1689. So again, the fact that he's appealing to the royal children, of which he is amply qualified, given again that is his history at the Priory at Caranac, but the fact that he's also the religious instructor and spiritual director of Madame de Maintenon ensures essentially that he's essentially surrounding Louis XIV from a point of view of spiritual influence on all sides of the family. It was for Burgundy's edification, after his father had died and he himself had become the heir apparent, that Fenelon later penned his well-known novelistic critique of Louis XIV's absolutism called Telemachus. The spirituality that in part held this court group together bore a distinctively mystical cast. In Fenelon's case, that spirituality consisted of one long quest for what he called pure love for God and the eradication of self-love, or the amour propre. At first glance, that quest would seem to have been very Augustinian, therefore spiritually akin to what was then being called Jansenism. Look again, however, because for one thing, Fenelon's quest took place entirely within the domain of the conscious and the voluntary. I ask only for what is voluntary. Fenelon reassured the penitent, speaking of the many seemingly involuntary relapses into anxious self-concern along the way toward pure love. Although reliant on divine grace, progress towards pure love will be valorize the human role for free will, for you will always be free in God. Fenelon again promised, provided you do not imagine that you have lost your liberty. For another thing, the grace that finally prevailed when self-love relinquished its hold and pure love took over was hardly distinguishable from the divine itself, because in pure love, Fenelon insisted, the penitent's heart expands without limits, so that it becomes immense, with nothing restricting it. It fulfills the divine promise and becomes in due proportion the same thing with God himself. Indeed, pure love is attained precisely at the point where grace dissolves into the divine, where grace ceases to be the gift that the self possesses and becomes instead inseparable from its source in the divine. Fenelon's spirituality optimistically held out for the promise of a union with the divine, and as such perpetuated a more mystical variant of the 17th century, devout humanism, which itself took on the role of a 16th century Catholic League. All of these, again, elements are sort of echoing with the sentiment regarding self-love, the sort of denial of the self, and the aspect of the pure love, and the aspiring again towards the divinized sense of grace, all the way going back to Dante, and the desire, you can say, of Dante to return to Adam is the desire to see that man who is broken, man who is divided, man who is cast into many pieces, can be united, not just in terms of the commonwealth of man coming back together in a union, but also that there be a transcendent quality of man, the optimal state of man, which transcends towards moral perfectibility. So as we see with other more, again, Renaissance and medieval humanists, we see this being espoused in a figure like Fenelon at the beginning of the 18th century. Symptomatically, Fenelon's favourite theological references were not to St. Augustine or even to St. Thomas Aquinas, but one Francois de Sales, author of the Introduction to the Devout Life, who then became a saint, and to the mystic St. Teresa of Avila. Fenelon's own devout lineage was unimpeachable, going back to his uncle Anton de Sélénac, Marquis de la Motte Fenelon, who had been a member of the Company of the Holy Sacrament earlier in that century. In other words, the Fenelon family are part of a long-established community genealogy of devout Catholics, and this also encroaching upon the political space, not just the spiritual space. The mystical spirituality eventually got Fenelon into trouble, not because it was inherently very unorthodox, but because it led to him to have a spiritual collaboration with one Madame Guyon, whose own mystical effusions were less doctrinally disciplined than his. Introduced to Fenelon in 1688, Jean-Marie Bouvier de la Motte enjoyed the confidence of the group for a while, including that of one Madame de Maintenon, the morganatic wife of Louis XIV, who introduced her and her writings to the aristocratic convent of Saint-Cyr. But Guyon had some formidable enemies, among them Francois de Hollet de Champvallon, Archbishop of Paris. Champvallon tried to cast doubts on her orthodoxy by associating her spirituality with the recently condemned Molinos heresy, the Quietist heresy, which held that mystical union with God exempted those so favored from the standards of ordinary morality. That is the great admonition directed against Pelagianism, which isn't just true of the Quietists, it's also very true of other religious groups, such as the Jesuits. A certain moral apathy that sort of clouds over, or at least the accusation of moral apathy. Alarmed, Maintenon took steps to distance herself from Saint-Cyr, from Guyon, and tried to persuade Fenelon to follow her. But when he instead undertook to Guyon's defence, Maintenon and Louis XIV unleashed Bishop Bossuet on the both, leading to Fenelon's exile from court, to his bishopric in 1697, as well as a papal condemnation of his defence of mystical tradition in 1699. Again, it's interesting reading this because I have read it elsewhere in various biographies that it was actually Fenelon responding to Bishop Bossuet. Bossuet gives his exposition of the 34 articles against Madame Guyon, and Fenelon writes his maxims of a saint in opposition to the exposition given by Bossuet. So that would almost again make Fenelon seem to be proactively preempting this, again, you can say disastrous response from Louis XIV, when I think in terms of Fenelon's character, he believes this consistent with his own desire not to overly condemn Madame Guyon. From the point of view of Fenelon, Madame Guyon is at fault, but nevertheless she doesn't deserve to be condemned twice over, essentially for the same sins. So again, it's a question of whether you're going to lay this at the feet of him responding to Bossuet, or Bossuet being unleashed to challenge him after he essentially had decided to overstep the mark and lead a defense of Madame Guyon without any provocation. Fenelon did not manifest any opposition to absolutism until a decade or more later, when the Duke of Burgundy had become the Dauphin, and Louis XIV's absolutism had run afoul of the War of Spanish Succession. Yet the opposition, when it developed, implicated the same kernel group as before, Bavilliers, Chevreuse, as not hard to see that in this character, a political extension of Fenelon's mysticism, a new society of the devout faction. In other words, even though he had been stripped of his influence at court, and even though he'd been forced into domestic exile in Cambrai, he was still able to assert a tremendous influence through his intermediaries. As in the case of the old devout party's opposition to Richelieu, this is referring back to all the way to the 1620s and 1630s, when Catholics opposed the wars of Richelieu to side alongside the Protestants in the War of the 30 Years' War. Again, if there is a consistent policy of the Catholic League in the 16th century, the original devout party in the time of Mary de Medici in the 1620s and 1630s with Richelieu, or indeed to Fenelon's own group, it is not pacifism, but it's resisting wars of aggression, to try and, again, distill the point as simply as I possibly can. And so, as we see the quote-unquote wars of aggression fought by Louis XIV, and the accusation that Richelieu was again fighting wars of aggression at that time against the Habsburgs, that all this policy is basically being repeated, and the same group is coming to the fore with the same message. In this case, it is now Fenelon who is leading the intellectual drive to criticize the king's bellicose foreign policy. And as you can see, with his attitudes towards the unity of mankind, very consistently humanist, and his attitudes towards Protestantism, this wouldn't be inconsistent with Fenelon. Fenelon's group opposed the Bourbon policy of dynastic war, even if prosecuted in part against Protestants, as well as courtly waste and luxury, even now concentrated outside sinful Paris at Versailles. What was also new to the latter 17th century was that war and luxury had become more explicitly associated with each other as parts of the state policy called mercantilism, for which the manufacture and export of artisanal luxuries were among the ordinary means in the state's pursuit of economic advantage and war, and the continuation of the same pursuit by other means. Against that policy, Fenelon therefore opposed the humanistic principle of peace and the unity of all humankind. The human race, Fenelon, constituted a single family. But again, this all sounds very idealistic coming from Fenelon, and recently there has been produced a rather interesting exposition of the ideas of monarchical reform, Jacobite monarchical reform in the 17th century, but also focusing a lot on the ideas of Fenelon. This is a book called The Ideas of Monarchical Reform by Andrew Mansfield, and it focuses quite extensively on Fenelon. This in particular accounting for Fenelon's rise and his career in the court of Louis XIV in France. Francois de Salignac de la Motte Fenelon received his position as the young Burgundy's preceptor on the 17th of August 1689, Unavoid's tutor, under the mentorship of a number of important benefactors attached to the French court, including the Bishop of Meaux, one Jacques Benin Bossuet, who I've mentioned already. Fenelon became a rising star of the Gallican Church, the church in France. His Traité de l'éducation des filles, the treatise on the education of girls, had generated friendship with the Duc de Beauvilliers and his brother-in-law, the Duc de Chevreuse. Both men were high-ranking officials in the court of Louis XIV, had married the daughters of the king's former finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Beauvilliers and Chevreuse were appointed as governors to Burgundy, and they charged Fenelon with his education and that of his younger brothers, the Duc d'Anjou and the Duc de Berry. It was during this period that Fenelon wrote his fables, his Dialogue des Morts, the dialogues with the dead, and Telemachus for the young princes. He eschewed the staid and didactic teachings that Bossuet had employed for their father, the Grand Dauphin, selecting a more entertaining but focused education, reliant upon a mixture of scripture, mythology, religious morality, and classicism, and that, of course, accounts for his fables at the same time. But all of this is consistent with the notion that he is, in many ways, a religious humanist. All of the tropes of, and consistent with humanism, are identified with the figure of Fenelon. And it's not just, again, for the point of view of reifying the classics and trying to bring about a, what he said again, a reification of the profane in Greece and the sacred with the epistles of St. Paul. But his desire again to use these as part of the Mos Maiorum, as Plutarch would, talking about the lives and the dialogues of the ancients as a way basically of having a moral formation on the opinions of the youth. These methods proved to be so effective in instructing the Duke of Burgundy that he was transformed from a recalcitrant, irascible child to a rather pliable, perhaps evenly led adult. Throughout his life, Burgundy continued to seek counsel and approval from his mentor Fenelon, as the two men discussed the reorganization of France, in which the Archbishop would be the dominant voice. In these educational pieces, Fenelon created a collection of children's allegories that comprised several principal themes repeated throughout all three of the works. Within the moral lessons on good kingship can be found censures on absolutism, poor counsel, the pursuit of glory, together with notable denigrations of war and luxury. The overarching theme is that to be a good ruler, a king should labour for his subjects while retaining honesty and virtue. He must be moderate when dealing with his people, using the law to ensure that a king should not be counted on at all times to offer justice, while protecting the poor as well as the honour and liberty of his people. This was achieved by ruling disinterestedly, suppressing his personal desire to concentrate on policies and maximize the public good. And this would be consistent with his idea of pure love, which in part is the eradication of self. That would also carry over into politics. Ultimately, this would only be assured if a king were willing to sacrifice his own liberty, like a slave, to focus on the requirements of his people above all other considerations. Such behavior was enshrined by three key lessons. The first, the practice of strong leadership. Not only should a king be altruistic in his administration, he must also avoid the temptation to arrogantly pursue excessive power, Absolutism or tyranny confirmed a king's misery. It detached the king from his people, when he should in fact be bound to them as a teacher or a shepherd. Absolutism over a subject manifested a corruption in the ruler, as in the individual, whose private ambition had subverted his public duty. The will of the king no longer retained a bridle for his passions and followed a path that rejected the people's needs. Such unlimited power was undesirable, and it led to a yearning within the people to overthrow or even assassinate the king, who did not represent their welfare. Absolutism was therefore never an attractive alternative. It exhibited poor leadership and revealed a weak king whose subjects were slave to his will. In terms of that being rather prophetic, that essentially was my argument for how the monarchy in France, the absolute monarchy in France, became effectively de-Christianized. In identifying the person of the monarch so much with the idea of the state, having a man who was weak, let alone having a man who is both weak and morally weak, fundamentally destroys, corrupts, and annihilates the whole notion of sacred monarchy. When you have a figure who is essentially a walking personification of vice, in this case lust, like Louis XV, his foibles, his mishaps, his vices become the vices of all of France and all the system in which he represents. And if you're again to look at the whole becoming of the notion of the ancien regime, something where there is a France which is essentially distanced itself from the king, when the king and France become two distinct entities. That is when a king has attempted again to so consciously associate himself with the glory and power of France, but the king himself is so completely lacking in the leadership qualities and even the self-effacement, the desire to be a slave to his kingdom. Instead, he has become a slave to his passions, and so doomed to the prospect of kingship and essentially act as a tyrant over his people. That, I would say, is a rather rote understanding of Louis XV, to be sure, but I think it's rather convincing. And again, given the fact that Fenelon was writing this 20 years, well, at least 30 years before Louis XV's character would ultimately be demonstrated, it proved to be very prophetic. Fenelon's humanistic approach to politics and spirituality allowed him to seek the virtue and reason of the ancients, holding a mirror to modern society that reflected its corruption. This is why, again, I was going back to my little quote from Bessarion through Fenelon in the Dialogues with the Dead, given the fact, again, that this may be seen as a form of intellectual retreat. You know, the ideas of Plato's Republic and Lycurgus and Solon, they have no concern for us, except again as a, you can say, a Cicero reborn. He would want to find good account of example of good rulership, good constitutions, and the good management and keeping of an estate or a kingdom. And as he then goes on to say, the application of classical civic virtue, evident in Cicero, for example, combated existing social problems, luxury's destruction of frugal simplicity. Moreover, Fenelon's conviction that a king could act altruistically, in other words, disinterestedly, without self, towards his subjects, was not only located in Christian teaching, but also found in the ancient thought. Again, this is part of the progress of humanism or medieval humanism, as I'm going to really expand upon that notion towards the end, which is this idea of trying to reaffirm Christian teachings and Christian truth through looking at the virtues of the pagan societies and civilizations before, in particular Aristotle, but of course this goes across so many different thinkers, of which Fenelon is indebted to so many. I would personally say that, you know, Plutarch and Virgil play heavily on Fenelon's conception here, but you could apply this to so many more. Such love transcended egoistic considerations, practicing a simple life of humility and sacrifice to God. This interpretation was transposed to the political utopias to find a corrective for contemporary France and the rule of Louis XIV. Fenelon anchored civic virtue, duty to the state in an altruistic capacity to surrender oneself to God through selfless love. These earlier works apply the ancient political thought, the classical political thought, amalgamating it with Christian virtues, in which the king and subjects are elevated through virtue and sacrifice. After years of Louis XIV's egoistic policies, a corrective was required that ensured the needs of the people were placed first. In contrast to Bossuet, who also embraced classical influences to promote the public good. Fenelon did not believe in its creation centered on the king's experience, but rather that the care of the people should be preeminent. What was unusual about Fenelon's French sovereignty was that he made the king secondary. The king's fostering of the public good was not for his own benefit, but for his people's benefit. A king must therefore sacrifice his own selfish wills and desire for the much larger consideration of the public good. In return, the virtue and love of the populace for their ruler ensured a mutually beneficial and harmonious relationship in which liberty was allowed to flourish. If a king sacrificed the public good to tyranny, he naturally exposed himself to the risk of rebellions or assassination by the people. If you look at this, Fenelon is one of these fascinating figures who is claimed by both traditions. He's claimed on the one hand as nothing more than a Catholic reactionary and the throwback, yet on the other, especially with the emphasis on the treatise of the education of girls, he is claimed as an early philosopher, as a French Enlightenment thinker. And if you look on that description that Mansfield has just given, you can very much easily apply that to Voltaire and the enlightened despot maxim: everything for the people, nothing by the people. The king is there for the public good first, in which essentially the whole king's identity, the self of the king, is effectively annihilated. But of course, unlike what we see with Voltaire, it's thoroughly Catholic in its conception. But you can also say at the same time, especially if you look at Fenelon's views of someone like a Solon or someone like a Lycurgus, you can even say that this is a crowned republic or a truly sort of I'm not going to necessarily say democratic form of kingship, because that would be an oxymoron, but part of, again, a monarchical experiment which eschews all luxury for its own sake, and again is focused on the maximizing of the public good. Again, you can look at this and you can look at Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke and the social contract and conclude that Fenelon, again, would, in some universe, actually sit quite nicely alongside these figures, but also realize again that many medieval thinkers were thinking along the similar lines as with many classical thinkers. And really what it seems to me that Fenelon is doing, he's less trying to create a radical new form of government, as many of the Enlightenment figures would essentially claim, but he's trying to restore a older conception of monarchy, where the monarch was seeming to be constrained by forces and was willing to accept those constraints, as opposed to the whole notion of divine right, automatic succession, and absolute monarchy, where the king is only accountable to God. But again, if you accept Fenelon's line of reasoning, and true liberty and true love is only to be found in God, if the king is not completely given over to the love of God and has given up everything about himself, then that is a natural environment, an experiment in potential tyranny. The development of the 17th century France saw a twofold assault on the people by the executive and political economy, that being the absolute monarchy and mercantilism. In Fenelon's eyes, both were riddled with corruption. Louis XIV suppressed the people's liberty through absolutism, while luxury celebrated greed and assaulted morality. Independently of British reaction to these issues, the use of similar classical sources elicited a response congruent with that of Cato's letters and the story of Bolingbroke. In other words, some people believe that Fenelon was effectively casting himself in opposition to Louis XIV, acting as a Richard II type figure, which again would, if you followed the logic of the War of the Roses, inevitably lead in the usurpation. The context in which Fenelon was writing for Burgundy was one of almost continual warfare for France and Europe. From 1688 until 1713, France had been engaged in the 9 Years' War, followed by the War of Spanish Succession. For reference, this goes on from really 1688 to 1613, with only a brief 1713, with only a brief interruption. Against the Grand Alliance, these wars were driven by French attempts to extend its authority beyond its borders, and the collective reaction of a number of European princes to Louis XIV's behavior. Indeed, Louis's entire reign had been dominated by war. Not long after he acceded to the throne, France was plunged into the Fronde, an internecine civil war fought mainly between the king's supporters and disaffected nobility. Following the death of Cardinal Mazarin, who was Louis XIV's regent, Louis began to administer the kingdom alone in a series of lesser wars ensuing, which included the Wars of Devolution and the Dutch Wars. in particular, again, in the Dialogues on the Dead. Fenelon talks about the notion of regency rather explicitly, and actually has a dialogue between Cardinal Mazarin and Cardinal Richelieu. Historians have debated the stimulus of France's engagement in war, questioned whether it was driven by Louis XIV's quest for glory or an attempt to become the universal monarch of Europe. For reference, I have continually argued that if there was a grand strategy for Louis XIV, it was exactly that. It was the universal monarchy for Europe. But that's not to say that glory didn't play a instrumental role in the wars as well. If you look at the court of Louis XIV as the Sun King, as every single matter, great and small, so long as it pertains to the king's person becomes a matter of state, like a permanent theatrical troupe around the king. Every noble has been reduced simply to a part performed on the stage. Then that similar role, war, is itself theatre. I mean, again, to use a rather trite example, with Commodus and Gladiator, Commodus asks, what is glory? What is a vision? It's a vision of a conquering Rome, and so he brings these glories into the Colosseum. In the case of Louis XIV, he would literally lead trips of his ministers and his courtiers and foreign ambassadors to the newly constructed Vauban fortifications on the north of France in order to witness the war. So witnessing the vision and glory of France was inseparable with the absolute monarchy, with divine right. But you can basically say, as I'm trying to argue here, that that was a second order effect from the universal monarchy being the overriding grand strategic objective of Louis XIV. What is certain, and by that I mean ultimately displacing the Habsburgs and becoming Holy Roman Emperor, what is certain is that many of France's contemporary rivals were in no doubt that this French aggrandizement was fed by a desire for hegemony. The result was a Europe driven by conflict, as it had been for centuries, while states aligned to prevent French supremacy, making France increasingly unpopular internationally. Furthermore, in a government shaped by war, bellicose foreign conflict had dominated state policy while depleting resources at home. And that's not to say Louis XIV was uniquely guilty of this, as has already been mentioned, Cardinal Richelieu, during the other, again, ascent of an old devout faction in the French court, was responsible for his war's interventions against Spain and the Habsburg in a 30 Years' War to prop up Protestant Sweden and the Protestant princes within the Holy Roman Empire. But you also have to go back to the wars of Francis I. I mean, if I'm going to be very partisan about this whole issue, Francis deserves most of the blame for this. He was the one who, having sort of, betrayed his promises at Pavia, another dialogue, it should be mentioned, in Fenelon's Dialogues of the Dead, he talks about the Pavia conundrum. He goes off to form an alliance with the Ottoman Sultan against the Habsburgs, thus basically engendering centuries of conflict. The consequences of prolonged war were confronted in Fenelon's unsent letter to Louis XIV, which expressed his unhappiness at the condition of France. The letter attacked the devastation wrought by France upon the French and European people, citing Louis's pursuit of glory as the cause. The king had surrounded himself with flatterers and advisors who magnified his authority and ego, thereby ruining France. His kingship had become lost for a mismanagement of the administration, poor government policy, and a monomaniacal obsession with war. Constant warfare had decimated the country. The land was cultivated and had become depopulated. Commerce had decreased and taxation demands had impoverished the people. The lost scrutiny of the public good meant that Louis had essentially turned his backs upon his subject and God, which had led to sedition and rioting. Such criticism was redolent of the Huguenot exile Pierre Giraud. Like Giraud, Fenelon claims that the king's severance from his people had been caused by excessive elevation in status, and that elevation of status being directed towards the desire to become the ruler over all Christians, no matter what the cost. Again, if I were to try and, again, understand the limitations of this form of critique, it's true that Louis XIV's wars had very mixed results. They weren't as effective as Napoleon's wars. We aren't seeing the near total conquest of Europe as we saw with Napoleon. We're seeing the sundering of provinces like the Free County of Burgundy and Strasbourg, and areas in Artois, and even regions like Roussillon were really already sort of taken over by them. So not groundbreaking conflicts, but nevertheless, if there is some sort of deeper strategy in there, again, it seems that Fenelon is not so convinced by it. Throughout his examination of conscience, another work by Fenelon, Fenelon impressed upon the Duke of Burgundy the necessity of engaging in war for reasons other than glory. Peace should always be sought, as war harms subjects and foreigners alike, and he should remember the dictum that your enemy is your brother. Again, this going back to Fenelon, work of Protestantism, his universalism, essentially Fenelon's belief that anyone effectively could be convinced to become your ally. The work was written at the beginning of the War of Spanish Succession, as France and Spain fought an alliance of other European rivals over the right of the Duc d'Anjou, Philip V of Spain, to ascend the Spanish throne. Several of Fenelon's memoirs, written to Burgundy between 1701 and 1710, discuss the consequences of the war. Before it had begun, Fenelon argued that the war would not be worth the trouble of victory, contained no great benefit for France. Rather than threatening the borders of the Spanish Netherlands, Louis XIV should assuage Dutch fears of French expansion by mollifying anxieties over the loss of independence. 8 years later, the Archbishop's qualms about the perils of war had been borne out, as the French army had become demoralized, the state was bankrupt. After the losses of Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenarde, the towns were depleted. People no longer lived like most men. They had lost patience in war. The physical strains, the loss of farming and livestock, meant that people were starving, and there was social disorder. Fenelon's province of Cambrai had witnessed the first effects of war, and he believed that the nation was falling into disgrace, becoming the object of public derision. Success was uncertain. Paris could be attacked, and France was at the mercy of its enemies. The solution was for the French to sue for peace. Louis XIV should seize the initiative and place himself at the center of peace negotiations to become an arbiter and general mediator of Europe instead of a figure of antipathy. The destructive outcomes of the war in which Burgundy fought realized two significant elements of Fenelon's political thought. The first was that the intense abhorrence of war, expressed throughout his works, found its basis in the constant threat of war during the early modern period, the suffering and breakdown of social order provoked by the competition of kings and calamitous for many. Second, Fenelon's instructions for Burgundy to abjure war were seriously intended. In his supplement, located at the end of his examination of conscience, it offered an intervention into the perpetual peace plan tradition, in which Fenelon posed a stratagem for preventing European war through the development of a League of Peace. With France as the intended target, the League would offset any attempt by a larger state to undermine the balance of power in Europe, as others could unite against the aggrandizing power. The conflagration of war and any attempt to achieve a universal monarchy would therefore be neutralized by an interdependent coalition. Europe could live in a harmonious cooperation rather than destruction, as Fenelon foresaw. And again, this is very interesting for many different reasons. One, the emphasis on presenting Louis XIV as the grand mediator and the arbiter of Europe. The other figure who I've mentioned who advocated the exact same policy for the other great French warmonger, that being Napoleon, was none other than Charles-Maurice Talleyrand, who was also a bishop. However, there is no figure probably more dissimilar to Fenelon than Talleyrand, but it's interesting that they were both advocating the exact same foreign policy. In the case of Talleyrand, it was the idea that following the Ulm campaign in 1805, before the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon should have made a grand alliance with Austria and used it to keep the Russians out of Europe and, by extension, placate the British. In this case, this whole idea of the League of Nations or the League of Peace, you can again say that such as sort of alluding to more modern notions. I mean, I already mentioned the League of Nations, but this was actually something that was achieved. It wasn't achieved under French direction, it was achieved under Austrian direction, that being Metternich and the quote-unquote Holy Alliance, the Metternichian system, the Carlsbad decrees. After Napoleon fell, Europe was able to maintain more or less consistent peace up until 1848. And even from the period from 1815, the definitive fall of Napoleon, up until the First World War, Europe did not know nearly as much war on the continent as it had in the previous century. So rather than looking at Fenelon as the anticipation of someone like a Wilson, I think it's fairer to say, given his overall outlook, that Fenelon is actually anticipating a figure like Metternich. And as we saw with Talleyrand, Metternich was anticipating a post-Napoleonic world. So Fenelon is perceiving again the opportunities which are afforded after the death of Louis XIV, with the Duke of Burgundy being his own peacemaker king. In the case of Metternich, the idea of universal monarchy was shelved in terms of promoting the League of the Three Emperors, even though that was a later Bismarckian contrivance, the Protestant king of Prussia, the Austrian Catholic emperor, and the Russian Orthodox Tsar. In this situation, again, it seems that the natural configuration of any alliance would be between Austria, France, and England. And indeed, this whole notion of achieving the balance of power in Europe was something that was seriously evolving as a consequence, you can say, of the failure of the religious wars. It became basically explicit British policy, but also French policy throughout much of the 18th century. So what Fenelon was effectively doing was foreseeing and predicting much of what would occur, and indeed anticipating something that would, to some extent, be achieved under a figure like Metternich. The most salient of Fenelon's later political works was the Table de Cholin, the Plans of Government. It outlined in some detail designs for a future France after the death of Louis XIV. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the work, written in November of 1711 as the war dragged on, looked at a means for immediately ending hostilities. Despite the instigation of peace discussions as early as 1708, the conflict had continued as Louis XIV had sought greater concessions for a peace treaty. Fenelon pushed such considerations aside and demanded an immediate cessation of aggression, including the loss of Cambrai and Arras. And of course, that would effectively mean that his own possessions would have come under the authority of the Austrians. If peace could not be achieved, then France must pursue a defensive war, which would run a council of war that contained marshals and other aristocratic experts who would shape military policy. In opposition to the expansionist martial strategy of Louvois, the army would have reduced from 400,000 men to 150,000 men. Again, a fascinating aspect, a really fascinating aspect of the French system of absolutism, just how many men Louis XIV was able to continue in a permanent standing army. In the days before the French Revolution, seeing armies on the scale of 100,000 men, 200,000 men, 400,000 men, Europe really hadn't seen such conflict and such wars at that time. But again, just for reference, Fenelon really does seem to be advocating who would almost see peace at all costs in this situation, because if you're going to look at the course of the war of Spanish succession, France begins the war by doing very well. Disaster from the period of around 1705 up until 1708, and then the war starts to go in France's favor towards the end, 1712, 1713. So perhaps you can say ultimately Louis XIV was correct in terms of assessment that France could turn the tide, and it did. This would make it difficult for France to wage war against Europe again, and it would instead have to seek alliances as the basis of foreign policy. The reduction of the army would see the beginning of a general assault against wasteful court expenditure. Beauvilliers and Fenelon had actually contracted all of the Intendant of France prior to the Archbishop's exile to Cambrai, receiving statistical information regarding the state of the French economy and finances at a local level. Again, consider this. Consider a tutor to Baron Trump asking all of the governors of America for detailed expenditures and statistics so they could organize a complete restructuring and reform of the American state. That is effectively what Fenelon is doing in his position. All he is a influential party attached to an influential duke who was at one point again spiritual director to the morganatic wife of Louis XIV and the tutor of the second in line to the throne. So again, the fact that he's asking for this sort of information and he has that sort of influence is really quite remarkable. All but one of the intendants who had died responded, and this information was used in the tables to provide a realistic assessment of the nation's problem and solution. Again, not just the temerity in terms of being able to ask for that information, but the fact that he was influential enough in order to have received it, despite, again, Louis XIV's imposition of exile upon Fenelon. The surfeit of pensions, salaries, and possessions would be controlled by sumptuary laws that would emulate the Romans in regulation of excessive consumption, which included luxury. To achieve this, the present state expenditure, which included the king's debt, had to be calculated and contrasted with revenues. Agriculture, crafts, and trade would spearhead an economic recovery of the almost bankrupted France. Such growth relied upon the freedom of trade as the state stepped away from mercantilism, although sumptuary laws would prohibit luxury and financiers. To relieve the people's suffering, tariff levels would be discussed, the unpopular gabelle, the salt tax would be abolished, and economic policy revitalized through deliberations and the re-established Estates General. Ultimately, all economic policy should be settled by the Council for Trade. The burden of expenditure would be discussed by cooperating with the estates rather than enacting them arbitrarily, as the provinces were granted autonomy and leaving the local revenues to policy. Again, if you read this, it comes across to me as very emblematic of what we see with Turgot at the beginning of the reign of Louis XVI. For reference, this occurs 70 years after we see the rise of the physiocrats, who are saying in many ways that Fenelon, looking at the combination of sort of agrarian free trade, is presaging many of the arguments of the physiocrats. And again, the imposition of sumptuary laws is not just the fact that he wants to limit excessive spending, but he essentially wants again to emulate the classics. He wants to emulate, Roman society and norms. Again, that was a major theme running through the American revolutionaries, returning to classical severity, simplicity. He is anticipating the style of the early French Revolution, and indeed part of Louis XVI, that being in the 1770s and 1780s. So as we saw essentially that Fenelon was in many ways anticipating what Metternich would do with the concert of Europe in the 1800s, he seems here to actually be anticipating a lot of the policies that would be tried by Louis XVI. And again, perhaps the argument could be made that had these policies been implemented 70 years earlier than they were ultimately tried, the French state would be in a much better position with far greater levels of free will and positive, again, sentiment directed towards the state for the policies to actually achieve results. The enhancement of the Council for Trade reflected an aspiration within the tables towards the expansion and decentralization of the French government. Beginning with tax collection, there would be a shift from the intendant system to use an assiette in each province, a small diocese in which the bishop, local nobility, and the third estate would settle taxation. In other words, a move away from the burgeoning idea of a bureaucratic superstate in Paris and a desire to see a restoration of, many people basically looked at this and said this was actually trying to make a functioning system of feudalism work again. If you're going to try and understand the reasons as to why, again, understanding Louis XIV, understanding Cardinal Richelieu, understanding Louis XIII, part of the reason as to why the Estates General, which Fenelon is basically emphasizing had to be re-established, were put on permanent hiatus, is essentially the idea that feudalism in France had failed. And they'd failed because during the French Wars of Religion, many of the local nobility and indeed a lot of the clergy rebelled against the king, and they became Calvinists, which is where we get the origin of the term Huguenots. And so between the Catholic League and between the Protestant League, the Politique faction, those again ostensibly advocating for the reason of France and France's interest to supersede everything else, come to Baudin's ideas on sovereignty, and by extension, France having an independent foreign policy from religion. Everything essentially that Fenelon is arguing against. Fenelon is the great admonition against France's political sovereignty and France having a self-interested foreign policy, which of course is completely consistent because his emphasis on pure love, love which is self-interested, the removal of self. It also, by extension, perhaps would imply the abolition of France at the same time in order to achieve the unity of mankind. And if you're going to look at it from that point of view, given that so much of the project of French absolutism was founded on the idea of patriotism, you can understand why this would be so popular. But what he's essentially trying to do is restore a system of government that had up until this time failed. And French absolutism was, you can say, an earnest attempt by Louis XIV to ensure a religious and monarchical supremacy over France, where the king was France and to be French was to be Catholic. So embarking upon this policy, again, you can say abstractly, these are all good things. The estates working together, the nobles, the third estate, the town dwellers with the bishops, in order to ease the suffering, prevent ruinous foreign wars, and ensure the growth and prosperity of the local economies. But I think it fundamentally ignores the reason as to why French absolutism came about in the first place, which is the absolute horrific state that France was in at the end of the 16th century. The Assiette would be subordinate to the reinstituted provincial estates. These involved members from all three estates, which would have the power to govern finance, the police, justice, trade, and agriculture. Fenelon pointed to the model of the Languedoc as a working example which survived Louis XIV's neglect of most of the provincial estates. Languedoc was seen to be a successful model of decentralized government. It engaged in a number of independent public works while supported by the crown, and has stimulated the local economy and raised taxes. This in opposition to, say, for example, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Controller General of Finances from 1660 up until 1682, who had financed such grand building projects as the Canal du Midi. But it should be mentioned again in defense of centralized economic planning of Louis XIV. Louis XIV was also responsible for the Vauban fortifications, and that meant, yes, France was fighting repeated wars, but it also meant that France was fighting repeated wars abroad. It wasn't having to deal so much with threats and invasions of Paris itself, because the northern frontier was now defended in a way it really never had been before. It had engaged in a number of independent public works while supported by the crown, and has stimulated the local economy and raised taxes. Fenelon used the example of Languedoc to underline the possibility of a loyal province that could cooperate with the crown, one that worked with central government yet remained semi-autonomous through its utilization of the local estates to run its affairs. This re-establishment of the estate system would enable freely elected deputies to settle issues. It would also develop an understanding for the needs of France as a whole as information filtered back to the crown. This move by Fenelon saw an assault on the absolutist pretensions of Louis XIV in favour of a more constitutional model, which Burgundy became king. The introduction of new assemblies below the King's Council, the reinstitution of the Estates General, the decentralization of power to include local government, and the inclusion of all members from all three estates represented a significant rejection of absolutism. Indeed, it does seem to me to be that Fenelon is attempting to, again, restore the system of government, how it ought to have essentially functioned before we had the disaster in France, which was the Protestant Reformation. So you can say, again, in terms of me trying to say that he is this, medieval medieval humanist, the whole notion of the estates, the local bodies, each local province having its own particular set of institution with its own officials, the nobility and the church and the towns all working together. This is the ideal of medieval autonomy, of medieval decentralization. It's why, some people look at the quilt work, patch quilt work of the Holy Roman Empire and see it as an archetype for what can essentially be achieved with political decentralization. And I believe that that's essentially what Fenelon hopes for his kingdom. And of course, by extension, the decentralization of political power in France, the decentralization of the economy, not only would it hopefully produce more prosperity and ensure again that there would be a break on the ability of the French state in order to engage in continuous warfare. So all of these things would go in tandem as part of an overall objective. Again, as far as I can read Fenelon, it does seem that he looks at absolutism as the deviation. His whole political project, his work, is in dealing with Protestants. That's how essentially he began his career. That's what he was so commended to Louis XIV. So having seen essentially the end of the French wars of religion, he essentially believes that it is possible to not coerce Protestants, but convince them to become Catholics. And in so doing, there can be a reification of an old medieval constitution with elements of neoclassicism, like the emphasis on Roman virtues thrown in, combined with religious concord and harmony. You can again say that this is overly idealistic, but Fenelon put in the time, the effort, and made plans and ordered the information to be drawn up for a specific timetable of political reform, fully anticipating that Louis XIV would die. What happens, however, is that Louis XIV lives far too long, and the Duke of Burgundy does, in fact, predecease him, as we see continue with Mansfield. In the end, Fenelon's reform plans for Burgundy were stillborn, as the prince died of measles on the 18th of February 1712. The archbishop was genuinely grief-stricken at the loss of his former pupil, and part of his devastation was born from the loss of optimism over the future of France. In a letter to the Duc de Chevreuse, Fenelon stated that all hope was gone for France and lamented the difficulties of an impending regency under a young prince. Yet within the same letter, Fenelon expeditiously pointed out the necessity of working with Louis XIV's wife, Madame Maintenon, to aid the young heir. A little over a week later, in a second letter to Chevreuse, he called for a plan of action to be created immediately. They owed it to Burgundy to create a council of regency that would protect and educate his son. The idea was crystallized in his memoirs for the measures dealing with the aftermath of the death of the Duke of Burgundy, 15th of March 1712. The work envisaged a means to provide the young prince with an effective education, ensuring that plans under Burgundy did not die. Its inception was taken so seriously by Fenelon that he persuaded his patron Beauvilliers to use his influence over Madame de Maintenon in an attempt to convince the king to act upon the proposal, and of course Louis XIV rejected the plan. In his memoir, Fenelon advocated the establishment of a regency council that would work with Louis XIV while he remained alive. The council would be selected from an assembly of notables. Fenelon suggested Beauvilliers, Chevreuse, Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon, very interesting relationship to Fenelon, but somewhat critical of him actually, but has a sort of remarkable appreciation for the work he did in terms of changing the character of the Duke of Burgundy. All members of the Burgundy Circle, as well as the Duc de Tallard, other ministers and secretaries of state, and headed by the Duc de Berry, Burgundy's brother. The council would have two main functions. The first was to educate the young Dauphin, using a curriculum which would be approved by the king until the prince's majority. The second function, carried out by the king's authorization, saw the council's involvement in the administration of government. The council would be attached to the Parliament of Paris, would assemble at least 6 times a year. As with the tables, further councils would replace the single secretaries of state as power was devolved from the king into the machinery of government, such as the Estates General and the Assiets. Again, this is a man who will die in a couple of years, and this is a man who is continuously using all the levers at disposal, all the influence. The fact that he's been able to bring such a vast network, the Burgundy Circle, in reference to his former pupil, the Duke of Burgundy, together in terms of seeing this project work. This isn't some random political theorist, critiquing from an armchair. This is a man who is dead set essentially on ending French absolutism and in finding any, again, potential comrade and partisan in terms of being able to achieve that. And were it not again for the fate of the Duke of Burgundy and the other maladies, essentially, they would face, political maladies that Fenelon would face. You can say in many ways a lot of series of political accidents. Then it's very possible that he could have had the predominating influence over France in the early 18th century. While the council would operate under the king, it would immediately begin to address the issue of state, such as the national debt and war. Fenelon foresaw many complications, but felt that the problems faced by France required an instant departure from Louis XIV's model of sovereignty. Louis's extraordinarily long reign had made government and his subjects accustomed to the absolute will of a single master. Overcoming this situation would be hugely problematic for France. Yet, if Louis died without making plans for the succession, government would have to frantically unify and organize itself in an attempt to stabilize France and fend off confusion. By creating these councils and using the term to administer government while the king was alive, it would allow for a smooth transition of power. They would assist in the reorganization of France while consolidating their position and continue assisting the running of France when the Dauphin finally reached maturity. France would fundamentally evolve from absolutism by establishing a wider government through the utilization of the councils, the Estates General, and the provincial assemblies comprising men from all three estates. In terms of, again, understanding this as why Fenelon is embraced, as a proto-philosophe, but I also see, if you're going to look at a later figure like de Maistre and figures who are criticizing the state of the Ancien regime in the wake of the revolution, I can't help but see that Fenelon is a template for many of the monarchical reformists, figures in the Restoration monarchy from 1815 until 1830. People who are prepared to look at the failings of absolutism in France and see that Fenelon was very well acquainted with all of the shortcomings and was able to provide a host of practical solutions for them, most of which involved essentially re-energizing institutions that the absolutist state had basically sought to suppress with all its might, and of course, in de-emphasizing the king from that of a demigod, as we saw of Louis XIV. As with the death of Burgundy and the table de Chollen, Louis XIV's rejection of the 1712 memoir meant that a substantial transformation in France did not occur. The Duke of Orleans, a friend and admirer of Fenelon, did begin his regency by observing some of the Archbishop's initiatives, but he returned to Louis XIV's model by 1718, and by this time Fenelon was dead. While peace was eventually established, that being peace of the Spanish War of Succession, Fenelon's reforms of state were shelved in favor of centralized bureaucracy as Orleans strengthened his position. As Fenelon's reorganizational plans were not published until later in that century, Burgundy's death deprived these private memoirs from being acted upon. Their absence from public view, combined with the success of Telemachus, ensured that Fenelon's earlier utopias remained the public focus for his political theories. What Mansfield is essentially illustrating there is that Fenelon had no interest whatsoever in courting public opinion. Whatever public opinion he was effectively able to court in his political programs was accidental, as we saw with the unsolicited, the unsanctioned publishing of Telemachus and what Fenelon basically believed to be an unfinished state, as I'll go over when I talk about Telemachus. But all of his campaigning is dynastic. It's all taking place within the remit of the court. And you can understand from Fenelon's point of view precisely why. I mean, as Jesuits are like to appeal directly to the political center, Jesuits are not keen in terms of being able to incite revolution from below by appealing to the lower orders. Fenelon has no interest in courting public opinion in terms of affecting a change in position of the monarchy. Fenelon wants to preserve the monarchy. He simply wants to reform it from above. He has no interest, essentially, in terms of inciting revolution from below. And Fenelon believes, perhaps quite rightly, that he has more than enough political supporters, whether it be in terms of Beauvilliers or Chevreuse or Maintenon, or even his royal pupil who predeceases him, unfortunately, in terms of his political programs. But all this is to say that Fenelon, perhaps again, was right in thinking that all his political writings needn't expand in terms of having a wider remit, essentially because he had cultivated enough interest, support, and influence among all the power brokers in France who could have affected the solution without destabilizing the situation in France. It's completely consistent with a man who focuses his entire ambition towards, you can say, the elimination of self and the pursuit of peace. Fenelon will not countenance any policy essentially which is seen as politically violent or inciting any sort of upheaval. Any other figure you can say in Fenelon's position who genuinely essentially wanted to push his programs or principles, regardless of any sort of superior concern or whatever, may have decided to polemicize, to reach out to a broader section, to form public opinion, to form pressure groups on various government officials and indeed the king to accept these reforms. But Fenelon's policy, right up until his death, right up until the point it's clear that it seems that all of his ideas may in fact die with him. What ideas don't die with him are essentially going to be there by the good grace of the Duke d'Orléans, the regent of France, who will of course renege and pursue a continuation with Louis XIV's policies. Fenelon was consistently and always a dynastic politician. And this comes to the last point, which is focusing on the idea of Fenelon the humanist. I came up with that sort of very reductive notion of essentially what it means to be a humanist. One is essentially looking at a desire to form a cultural ideal, a philosophical ideal pertaining to the reading of classics, Greco-Roman classics, but also in humanism there is an implicit idea, not just in terms of the moral improvement of man, but in terms of even the perfectibility of man, depending on how far your sort of Christian humanism goes. When looking at someone like a Dante Alighieri, I situate him clearly as both a poet and a political agitator, albeit Dante had virtually no influence. You can say he sought influence. In the case of the political group around Henry of Luxembourg, when he came and became Holy Roman Emperor in 1312, but that was, as we see with Fenelon, a political sort of pursuit, a desire, an ambition, a dream, a utopia that went nowhere. And so Dante had his critique. It was a critique against ultramonism, it was a critique against papal supremacy, the idea that the Pope could wield spiritual and temporal powers. In other words, much of Dante's work and much of Dante's De Monarchia, echoing a lot of the political treatise of Fenelon, which again have only, you can say, more recently been rediscovered and discussed by historians. And as a result, Fenelon is actually enjoying a greater reputation, again, perhaps equivalent to that of the, as we can see, inordinate influence he held in the later reign of Louis XIV around the circle of Burgundy, the court of reform. Dante was focused on critiques of the papacy, but in particular Boniface VIII. With Fenelon again is this classicist in terms of Telemachus, a poet, a very gifted author, writer, polemicist, and his main critique is, of course, that of his patron, Louis XIV. And like with Dante, he is affected by political exile, degrees of ostracism, and accusations of religious unorthodoxy, even heterodoxy. There are many startling comparisons to actually look at a figure like Dante and Fenelon. The only difference you can really see is that Fenelon was actually far more effective than Dante. Fenelon had far more influence over the affairs of France than Dante could ever dream of in terms of having the influence over Florence, let alone Italy. Again, if you look at comparing Telemachus, as I will, and it essentially being a moral counsel, a lesson for how a good king should run his kingdom. I've described it, and I will describe it in my future episode, as the Fenelon's anti-Machiavel Prince, which is actually an allusion to Frederick II's treatise of the same name. But anyway, but I'm not the only one to make this connection. So, for example, Jean-Claude Bonnet called Telemachus the true key to the museum of the 18th century imagination. And by that, he would be associating not just religious imagination, not just classicism, but you can say perhaps leading into many of the themes we have with the Philosophers and with the Enlightenment. Whereas I've always looked at Dante and Divine Comedy as the triumph of the late medieval imagination, in that it encapsulates so much. So I come back to the whole notion of, what is a humanist, and what would qualify Fenelon to be the last quote unquote medieval humanist. It really comes down to the difficulties of recognizing a Catholic tradition of humanism versus a secular tradition of humanism. As far as I'm concerned, medieval humanism, from a lot of historians, tends to reach as far as figures like Erasmus and then completely drops off. It's as if when the Reformation happens, people have this tendency, I would say it's a false tendency, and it sort of permeates into the history of ideas, of saying that one tradition that really sort of begins with the Church Fathers and reaches some sort of medieval epitome in a figure like Dante, dies, drops off completely, and instead is subsumed by Protestant writers, while Catholicism is supposed to have rejected humanism and embraced reactionary Tridentine reform and Counter-Reformation and all that. Whereas I think that's a very skewed way of understanding continuity in terms of intellectual thought and indebtedness to the classics. Rather, I think that the intellectual tradition that you see with Erasmus and Dante, going all the way back to the Church Fathers, it continues. It continues in spite of the fact that there are Protestants and there are Protestant critiques. It continues throughout the 16th century in France into the 17th century. And in a figure like Fenelon, you have all of the classical characteristics of a humanist writer, but still in the vein of a medieval humanist like a Petrarch, or to a much greater extent a Dante, situating all of his classical works, his focus on the Mos Maiorum, the great moral idea, under a Christian framework, and by extension being a Catholic framework. If you look at these as representing the same tradition, then again, I'm convinced to look at Fenelon as one of the last great medieval representatives of this tradition, before France becomes increasingly skeptical towards religion, and we have the encroachments of the Enlightenment. Really, a lot of people have looked at Fenelon as the beginning of one tradition, but I'm almost looking at him as the end of one. And it's very useful for figures like Enlightenment scholars, anti-obscurantists, to look at his treatise on the education of women and say that he was presaging many elements of the Enlightenment. A interesting trend of looking at Fenelon is also looking at his sort of influence that he has on Rousseau, which is also true. Fenelon has a lot of influence on the works of various philosophers going forward. But again, to think that he fundamentally shares their overall sort of values, I don't find that view very convincing. In order to really unpack this, I want to try and understand what would almost seem to be like a medieval contradiction, which is that humanism appears to be a movement born out of an aversion to Orthodox Christianity. When you have so much of this sort of derisive and comical expositions labeled against the medieval period, it tends to be that the medieval period is just an era of supreme bigotry. And so therefore a understanding and appreciation of trying to reify older forms of pagan knowledge is simply prima facie nonsense, and it cannot ever be reconciled with Christian teaching. That was definitely the view of some people. But the contention that a lot of historians of ideas have is that this fundamental contradiction cannot be resolved. And so humanism ultimately means the death of medievalism, whereas I don't see that as the case at all. I look at Fenelon and I see him as very much part of a Catholic, older humanist tradition that is trying to reach back to something, whether it be learning in the classical past or a constitution, recreating that which you essentially saw during the medieval period. I think that's very true of Fenelon. And like a figure like Dante was focused on the idea of renovating older medieval ideals, whilst also portraying them more cryptically and in some cases blatantly through his work of the Divine Comedy. So where does this idea come from of humanism in the Christian tradition? I want to start off by reading the Christian Doctrine by St. Augustine of Hippo. If those who are called philosophers, especially the Platonists, have said things by chance that are truthful and conformable to our faiths, we must not only have no fear of them, but even appropriate them for our own use, from those who are, in a sense, their illegal possessors. The Egyptians not only had idols and crushing burdens, which the people of Israel detested and from which they fled, but they also had vessels and ornaments of gold and silver and clothing, which the Israelites leaving Egypt secretly claimed for themselves as if for a better use. Not only on their own authority did they make this appropriation, but by the command of God, while the Egyptians themselves, without realizing it, were supplying the things which they were not using properly. In the same way, all the teachings of the pagans have counterfeit and superstitious notions, oppressive burdens of useless labor, which any one of us leaving the association of pagans with Christ as our leader ought to abominate and shun. However, they also contain liberal instruction, more adapted to the service of truth, and also very useful principles about morals. Some even truths about the service of the one God himself are discovered among them. They are, in a sense, their gold and silver. They themselves did not create them, but excavated them, as it were, from the mines of divine providence, which is everywhere present. But they wickedly and unjustly misuse this treasure in the service of demons. When the Christian severs himself in the spirit from the wretched association of these men, he ought to take it from them for their lawful service of preaching the gospel. It is also right for us to receive and possess their clothing in order to convert it to a Christian use, those human institutions suited for intercourse with men and which we cannot do without in this life. In other words, very much how Fenelon wants to treat the profane history of Greek civilization in order to provide that great moral instruction for what he believes is a truer Christian society through his pupil, the Duke of Burgundy, and through the Burgundy Circle, over which he had such a profound and almost hypnotic, mystical influence and presence over. In terms of this continuation of various figures who think along the same line as St. Augustine here, Origen, John of Chrysostom, St. Ambrose. In St. Ambrose in particular, who is responsible for converting St. Augustine, we have Cicero in De Officiis, and Cicero is one of these figures that I really need to come back to and talk about, the eternal Cicero. This whole notion of the early church fathers as humanists or patristic humanists is gone into a great amount of depth by Martin McGuire in his article Medieval Humanism. And I just want to really look into this article because I think it gives, again, a wonderful exposition about the continuity of the understanding of ancient pagan Greek myths and their relevance and their enduring significance to Christian thinkers. The importance of patristic humanism in the history of humanism can hardly be exaggerated. Through the greatness and authority of its representatives and their works, it set a basic pattern for the future. Moreover, through its theocentric character and its emphasis on literature and learning in the service of religion, it furnished the strongest stimulation and need for its own preservation and continued development. It must also be emphasized that patristic humanism coincided with, or perhaps better constituted, the most significant phase of the revival of Greek and Roman literature and scholarship in the 4th and 5th centuries. Werner Jaeger stated that there are still people who do not realize that we had in both hemispheres of the late Roman Empire at the same time was one of the most creative civilizations which Rome has ever seen. The synthesis of Christian religion and classical Greek and Roman culture, which it affected, became classical in its turn in the following centuries of the Middle Ages and the countless millions of people it still is. The subsequent history of the synthesis in Byzantium will have to be omitted for the sake of brevity, but it should be noted that the Byzantine Renaissance of the 9th century, during the age of the ecumenical patriarch Photius, played the same important role as with the Carolingian Renaissance. As for how much of a Renaissance the Carolingian Renaissance was, it's really sort of open to debate. I mean, that's a sort of a notion that has been very iffy as a question mark next to it. Certainly, the great sort of Renaissance that really we can definitively attest to is that in the 12th century, And again, what this whole idea of a Renaissance is, I'll come back to that at the end of the conversation. From the beginning of the Middle Ages in the West, the synthesis was already long completed. In fact, it had become a tradition, as is so clearly evident in the writings of Cassiodorus and Isidore, in particular is referring to Isidore of Seville, one of the great doctors of the church. That the tradition did not die, or at least suffer greater damage than it did in the 6th, 7th, or 8th centuries, this being in the quote-unquote Dark Ages, is largely to be explained by the fact that the Church in the West, having adopted Latin as the language of liturgy, theology, and administration of the Church, persisted in maintaining it, that being in particular the Frankish Empire, the Merovingians. Hence, in spite of all obstacles, Latin had to be taught, studied, with primarily practical ends in mind, owing to the strong authority of the Western Church and to the circumstances that she was the sole source and vehicle of higher culture for so long in Italy, Gaul, Spain, Ireland, and Britain, as later in Germany, Bohemia, Scandinavia, and Poland. All these regions, while developing many local variations in liturgy, especially in the early period, used Latin as their church language. The possible rise of liturgy in Gothic, Old High German vanished with the triumph of orthodoxy over Arianism, that being the Arian controversy by which many of the post-Roman Empire Gothic migratory kingdoms, such as the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, held to a notion of Christianity which de-emphasized Christ's divine nature. Under the influence of the patristic synthesis, the pagan as well as Christian classics sooner or later found curriculum in the monastic and cathedral schools. In other words, Catholicism kept the spirit of humanism, the spirit of the classics alive. Peoples outside of Romania, beginning with Irish and Anglo-Saxons, adopted medieval school curriculums with enthusiasm. They approached pagan classics without too many inhibitions, which troubled the minds of those in direct Latin tradition. Medieval humanism is based on this patristic tradition, but that does not mean it is absolutely uniform in scope, emphasis, or intensity. I don't believe essentially that the humanism that we see with Dante is the same humanism that we see with Fenelon, but there are some striking examples. The most important elements to be stressed: the unity of mankind, the perfectibility of mankind, the reification of mos maiorum, in other words, the lives and the sort of virtues that are to be found in ancient poetry, figures like Virgil, and how that this can be subsumed into a notion of Christian love. The numerous recent articles and books dealing with the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, one that was newly discovered, is valuable in that while recognizing a basic similarity or even identity in outlook, they focus necessary attention on a comprehensive, complex character of the movement in its totality, a pervasive influence on its different phases, and on the common and special features of each phase considered in and of itself. A number of articles focus on the Italian Renaissance, have contributed to a better understanding not only of a complex movement, but of a better understanding of medieval culture as a whole and the Renaissance thereafter. It would not be possible, nor is it necessary, to trace in detail the development of medieval humanism, whether that movement be regarded in a narrower or broader sense of the term, but a few general observations can be made before passing into consideration the harmony between faith and reason, which have been firmly established by the 13th century on the back of Aristotelian philosophy and the work of the Church Fathers. The story of the preservation of the classics in the Middle Ages and of the extent to which they copied, read, neglected, century by century, is very well known, and in its main outlines and to an increasingly great degree in detail. The school tradition of which they form such essential part besides Christian works is also becoming better known. In spite of the pardonable pride reflected in the enthusiastic words of the chronicler of St. Gall, in which he states that Alcuin's teaching was so fruitful that the Gauls and Franks of our time had become the peers of the ancient Romans and Athenians, the school curriculum of the Carolingians was largely confined in practice to grammar and a thin and superficial rhetoric. Dialectic and the subjects of the quadrivium only quadrivium, sorry, for some reason I can't pronounce that word, only came fully into their own. in the 10th and the 11th centuries, with Gerbert of Aurillac and the struggle of the over-investitures, the political, social, economic, and intellectual word of Alcuin, and was respectively primitive as compared with that of one John of Salisbury in the 12th century, which fully developed to a feudal system encompassing church and state, town life, its skills, its fruitful contacts with Islamic learning, its revival of Roman law, and rising universities. Building on the works of the Carolingians, schools of the 10th and 11th and 12th centuries, cathedral schools, forged Latin into a flexible instrument of literary and philosophical expression in which classical, Christian, and medieval elements were freely blended. St. Anselm of Canterbury, St. Peter Damian, St. Bernard de Clairvaux, John of Salisbury, Otto of Freising wrote Latin, not only with clearness and precision, but with force and warmth of style, and is associated with the mastery of using a language and with all of its potentialities. But in its poetry, medieval Latin reached a zenith in men like Hildebert of Lavardin, a Christian humanist in the spirit of the Renaissance, in the chief Goliath, and the greatest religious person in their achievement, beginning with the sequence of Adam of St. Victor and culminating in the Pangelingua of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Stabat Mater of Jacoba de Todi, and Desire of Thomas Aquilano. The production of a great universal literature in Latin was accompanied furthermore by related developments from the earlier Middle Ages, the Celtic, Germanic North from the 11th century, and the Romance lands of great literature and in the vernacular. The emphasis on Latin in the church and schools perhaps retarded a more rapid development of the vernacular literatures, particularly in the Romance lands, but these literatures only received written form through the Latin school tradition, and vernacular writers profited enormously through literary forms, rich content of ancient pagan and classical literature that was being made available to them. The Latin inheritance from antiquity and the whole literary and scholarly production of the medieval period itself in Latin, the common universal language, became a common heritage of a great vernacular literature in Europe and gave a common tradition and a basic relationship, which is such a vital and significant factor of the subsequent history of Western civilization. It is not surprising that under these circumstances that Dante, who was familiar with the Latin tradition, possessed a good knowledge of the Octores. He was a master of Latin style, has varied Latin treatise, but should decide, when it comes finally to his literary works, above all the Divine Comedy, to write in his Florentine vernacular, and thus the greatest, most mature, most characteristic literary achievement of Christian humanism in the Middle Ages should be a poem written not in Latin, but in Italian. Dante's judgment was a sounder, and his choice of language happier than that of his younger contemporary Plutarch, who was confident that his Latin epic, Africa, would be his chief claim to lasting glory. The emphasis here on Latin and the translation of the classics being so essential in terms of understanding humanism. What is significant with Fenelon is that we arrive at French as a lingua franca. Of course, all of his great writings are done so in French. They are done so for, again, religious instruction and education. Even though, interestingly enough, Telemachus would be translated into Latin, again, for the sake of poetry and prose, and in order to appeal to a style which a lot of people would have been able to read Latin at that time in the 18th century. Nevertheless, it was intended in French, and he wrote his works in the vernacular. If we're looking at medieval humanism being so associated with Latin as a lingua franca, but also having so many of these writers who were able to write prose in Latin, like with Petrarch and Dante, but in the case of Dante, are able to extend their intellectual and linguistic horizons beyond that of Latin in order to spread their wings and explore the potentialities of what would later become the Italian language with the Florentine dialect. Perhaps an argument could be made that as Latin falls out of favor in the 18th century, as it is French, it is diplomatic French that replaces Latin as a common language of diplomatic correspondence, trade, law, in many cases throughout Europe. Latin doesn't become completely eclipsed, but it certainly loses a great level of influence in the 18th century. And during the 19th century, you could say that influence of Latin becomes ever more sort of specialist, reduced to certain very specific elements, law in particular, I'll emphasize in terms of the continued use of Latin. But you can say the multilingualism, bilingualism, multilingualism in the sense that we're not just talking about Latin, we also talk about the usage of ancient Greek as well. If you take the free association and familiarity with these languages, Fenelon in particular was very well versed in Greek and Latin, but wrote in French. The loss of the understanding of these languages and the ability to freely access and converse and update and take your own spin on any of these particular classics, because Telemachus is not simply a rehash of certain elements of the story of the Odyssey, it's an innovation in many ways. To such extent, it became one of the most famous works of the 18th century. That to say that the loss of this bilingualism that we see, this understanding and fluency with Latin throughout the early modern period towards the period of the French Revolution, if there is some, again, other sign other than the decline in Catholic religiosity associated with medieval humanism, perhaps the end of Latin as a lingua franca is another sign of that. And again, Fenelon, as straddling both traditions, would again be seen to be at the tail end of the tradition of European Latin as a lingua franca for culture and understanding and letters. The Divine Comedy, however, should not be too exclusively viewed as a project of medieval humanism on the literary side. On the contrary, it is more typically medieval in its emphasis on philosophical and theological problems, on reason and revelation, on man and human nature, not merely in themselves, but in revelation to God, their creator and preserver. Moderns in general prefer the Inferno to the Purgatorio or the Paradiso, but for Dante, the Paradiso was by far the most significant part of his poem. We must consider, finally, therefore, all important questions, namely the role of philosophy and theology in medieval humanism, the assimilation of the late Hellenic philosophy and its utilization in the elaboration of Christian theology have one of the most important and influential features of humanism. It should be emphasized that by far the most important school of late Hellenic philosophy was Neoplatonism, a theocentric system whose thought was essentially religious in character. Christian Platonism, or rather Neoplatonism, of the fathers of the Church, especially as represented and developed by the great Latin thinkers St. Augustine of Hippo, combined with the Aristotelianism of Boethius, constituted the foundation of medieval thought. The Augustinian influence was preponderant, and thought long remained primarily theological. On that particular note, again, it should be emphasized that this is an interesting subsect of the dialogues. Fenelon again contrives a dialogue between Plato and Aristotle. With Abelard of Hugh and Hugh of St. Victor, we entered a new age of medieval thought. Abelard applied his powerful didactic to theology, and in spite of his condemnation on the charge of holding extreme views, dialectic henceforth was to play an important and fruitful role in theological speculation and systemization. Hugh of St. Victor, under the influence of Aristotle through Boethius and through the Aristotelian works becoming available in his own time, attempted in his Didascalium to give a comprehensive classification of all branches of knowledge, their objects and relationship. The essence of his Christian humanism is contained in statements like the following: the highest consolation in life is the pursuit of wisdom, and he who finds it is happy, and he who possesses it is blessed. The perfection of human life is accompanied by two things, knowledge and virtue, and in this perfection is contained our soul likeness to the heavenly and divine substances. Therefore, never consider any knowledge worthless, for all knowledge is good. Learn everything. You will see later that nothing is superfluous. By insisting on the sharp distinction between knowledge based on experience and knowledge based on faith, yet fully recognizing the necessity of faith, he contributed very much to the development of natural theology, and such would be consistent with Fenelon's views as well. Regarding this whole notion of the Renaissance, before I conclude here, my frustration of it is actually when it comes to the origins of the word. It's it sort of represents a genuine feeling, a sensation around the figures of Petrarch, but it was really a 19th century idea that came out of Jules Michelet and his histories. The other sort of words that are associated with the whole idea of rebirth, rinascimento, risorgimento. But when I look at figures like Petrarch and Dante and even Fenelon, it should be mentioned, the word that occurs to me, which I think is actually more historically apt in terms of the way that these people actually thought, is less Renaissance, because Renaissance implies that something is dead. Whereas I think, again, why I was sort of emphasizing and using that article was to communicate that whether it be patristic humanism or medieval humanism, this tradition didn't die, even in the situation where you had with the Merovingians and the Carolingians, the tradition was still kept alive in the monasteries. It simply wasn't as prevalent, with, say, for example, later become by the 15th century. So we have moments of diminishment, we have moments of darkness, and then we have moments of light. Renovatio is the word that comes to me because it's far less grandiose in terms of implication. It's simple renovation, not just in terms of moral renovation, ideological renovation, cultural renovation, but political renovation. Renovatio imperii, the idea of the restoration of the imperial ideal in Italy, for example. Petrarch and Dante wanted Italy to be great, and they wanted Italy to be home of a universal authority. Some were interested whether that be a pope or an emperor. In the case of Dante in particular, he wanted it to be the heart of a Roman Empire. Others, like Rienzi, that we wanted to be the heart of a great Roman Republic again. This is what is really meant by renovatio. These traditions haven't died. There is still an emperor, there is still a pope, there is still technically a Roman Senate, but these institutions are simply fallen afoul of what they should be, and they must be reclaimed and they must be glorified effectively. If you look at the work of Fenelon, not only is he trying to understand classical tradition, he represents that continuity with the various thinkers. He's trying to mesh it with his own sense of Christian mysticism. But he's also, again, trying to instruct its use and look at the figures of Solon and Lycurgus as metaphors in many ways. The dialogues is in many ways a series of arguments and stand-ins and attempts to try and force, you can say, various figures at various times to deal with their legacies, encapsulated through various points. And for Fenelon, the great renovatio, if you're going to look at his political project, would be the renovation of the French monarchy as it ought to be, as part of a greater European and Christian whole. You can, on the one hand, say superficially, oh, he's against the universal monarchy. Well, what does that mean to Fenelon? To be against the universal monarchy for Fenelon would be against the cause of the pursuit of war to achieve that end. There's nothing sort of axiomatic about Fenelon's humanism, again, that would arrive at a situation where he rejects the idea, should it be brought about by peace? Again, Christ is king, but Christ again is the Prince of Peace. These ideas aren't mutually incompatible. It's simply about means and ends. I think in that way, again, Fenelon is being very conservative in the sense that he's not prepared to corrupt the idea, which is Christian unity, through the relentless pursuit of aggression, coercion, warfare. It is the consistent way in which he approaches all aspects of his ministry, whether it be conversion of the Protestants or whether it be his political activism. If you look at other figures, again, which are credited in terms of influencing him, St. Teresa of Avila, Francis de Sales, even if you're going to take on the Quietist controversy, take on the position of Bossuet, and look at Miguel de Molinos, these are all part of a tradition of spiritual contemplation. I don't see them as part of a tradition of humanism by any sort of stretch of the imagination. But Fenelon was both a missionary and a poet, in terms of, again, finding a genealogy of ideas linking back to figures like Petrarch and Dante. Look at Erasmus. Erasmus dies in 1536, a great Latin scholar and a Catholic moderate, and like Fenelon, an educationalist, but one who ultimately rejects Protestantism. Another one of these figures in France, Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples, again dies 1536, an Aristotelian scholar and translator. Then you have his compatriot, Francois Dubois, again dies in 1536, a classical scholar at the University of Paris. These are sort of lingering elements of tradition, but the tendency of the history of ideas is basically, again, to cut these figures off with the advent of the Protestant Reformation. And I just don't see that with Fenelon. I see Fenelon as continuing in this tradition. Indeed, if you're a figure who I would say bears a striking similarity in France to Fenelon, it is actually Clément Marot, dies in 1544. Marot was an author of epic lyrical poetry. He was a translator of the Psalms into French, but he was also a translator of Ovid's Metamorphoses, in addition to Catullus and, of course, Virgil, who I believe was a great source of inspiration and intellectual indebtedness to Fenelon. And like Fenelon, Marot was a prominent member of the court of the King of France, then King Francis I, and then he became a political exile and was accused of religious heterodoxy, but he never converted to Protestantism. The degree to which he remained an Orthodox Catholic to the end essentially is a degree of is a hotly sort of debated subject, but nevertheless, I think there are elements of Clément Marot in Francois de Fenelon. Then we find an even more fascinating figure, de Montaigne, one of the most famous writers of the 16th century, most famous for the Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, which was seen by many Huguenots as an attack on royal authority, but in particular the Essays, which again owe a classical indebtedness to Plutarch and Plutarch's Morals. Regarding de Montaigne in particular, I was reading an article by one Bernard Rigaud, who was attempting to understand the philosophical relationship between Fenelon and Montaigne through the works of de Biron, a Restoration-era philosopher. So I'm not crazy in terms of trying to find all of these insinuations of a tradition. And of course, like Fenelon, de Montaigne found himself trying to follow a very difficult course in pursuing a middle way through the French wars of religion, in which he basically landed on the side of the politique, which was those basically in service of the cause of France. Then I've always argued in my other streams that the Jesuits represented not just a continuation of this spirit of medieval humanism, but of an international medieval humanism, expanding it in terms of being able to try and form a synthesis, an Aristotelian synthesis with the work, say, for example, of pre-sort of Neo-Confucian scholarship, and indeed trying to unpack and understand much of the history of ideas in Japan or China or India. The Jesuits were really at the intellectual vanguard in that, and of course, Fenelon was educated as a Jesuit. So Fenelon descends from all of these traditions: poetry, spiritualism, political commentary, education, a Catholic critique of monarchy, and a moderate missionary associated in a religious controversy. So the question then becomes, is Fenelon the end of a medieval tradition, or is he the beginning of a radical tradition? And that is a question with which there'll probably be no definitive answer. Anyway, thank you all very much for listening. It's been a rather obscure topic, but I'm sort of going fully into the more obscure as my channel progresses. I'll read the super chats, and if anyone wants to ask me a question, please do so while I'm here. Aaronfire359 for $10. Thank you very much. I'm celebrating the 4th of July with my family today, so I'm unable to watch this stream in full at the moment. Thank you for creating a lecture on this interesting topic. Well, thank you very much, Aaronfire. Yes, for any people who aren't Americans or are American and aren't celebrating the 4th of July, I suppose this is the place to be. Discussing the life of someone who isn't too obscure. He's becoming less obscure in terms of people understanding the significance of his work and his work being translated into English. But that's not a new thing. I mean, much of his work, I mean, some of the editions that I was reading from this evening are very old translations which have come around from the beginning of the 18th century. So some of Fenelon's earlier works, the Fables and Telemachus, were very popular in his era, but the whole sort of scope of his work since has sort of gone under translation and critical assessment. And I think the interest in Fenelon is only growing, especially as people are beginning to take a more nuanced view on the causes of the French Revolution. Ambivalent Teacher for $3 Canadian. Thank you very much. Can't Listen Live. Thank you for the great stream as well. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambivalent Teacher. Right, I do have to apologize. Before I leave. I have forgotten. I have failed in my fastidiousness, and I have forgotten to write up the bibliography for this night's episode. So I'll have to go away and I'll have to fill that in as soon as possible and remedy that mistake. I think that's the first time that's ever happened, actually. Clearly, I'm off the ball this evening. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and I will see you again soon.